Good morning. Today we're going to be working with two-dimensional arrays. So it's no different than a one-dimensional array, just with multiple dimensions to it. So context is not all that different. So here's our first example. It's an array of integers. As you notice, this would be considered one array, right? Starting at spot 0, spot 1, and so on, spot 4, one array. Then, right below it, we have another array, and another array, and so forth. We have 7 rows and 5 columns. So, when you make a two-dimensional array, you make it as with what row and column. So the first important concept that I want to talk about is when you make a one-dimensional array of integers, it would look like this. New int, and we would say there's 5 items in it, versus a two-dimensional array. We would have it look like, you would say this is rows is going down, so there would be 7 here, and then columns are going across, there's 5. Okay, so our first concept is a regular array versus a two-dimensional array. Okay, so the values, just like if you were to get the value at spot 0 of a one-dimensional array, you have to say what is the value at the column and the row. So here you have to access row first. So row 0, column 1 holds 42. Row 3, column 4 holds 93. Row 6, 2 would be 78, and so on. So to access values in a 2D array, you have to say the row and column. So here, if I said print the regular one versus a 2D array, I would have to say the array at 4, comma, and then whatever my next dimension is, or the row and the column. Okay, so here it's just important to know rows and columns are both 0 to n minus 1, just like a regular array. It always starts with rows first and then goes to columns. Okay, and it doesn't have to always be integers. It could be strings or booleans or anything. Just like a regular array, to make sure you don't go out of bounds, you have to check that your two-dimensional array doesn't go out of bounds as well. If you did try to access something that goes out of bounds, it would crash, and it would say array index out of bounds. So you want to make sure that you're accessing integer values, otherwise that would crash as well. And just like you could use our variables for to say specific location, you can do the same thing here. Okay, so here's our example. There's 2 ways that you can make it a 2D array. Just like I had earlier, integer, this is saying it's a 2D array of integers, whatever name you want. And now look at how I have create a already filled 2D array. You have an open bracket to say start my 2D array. This is saying what is the first row. You use commas, and you don't have to use an enter. All this could be just one long row. Just separate each row with commas. And then at the end, you have a bracket to make sure you do it. The other way you could have done it is just to say create this equals something like this, with this being rows, this being columns, and then said each value equal a new number. Okay, so here this is declaring a 2D array. This is initializing it with values. So when you make an integer array, this would be 3 rows going down and 5 columns going across, and every value would equal 0. Okay? Now, like we said earlier, you could also do it this way as well. Okay? So, the one thing that we first need to talk about is there can be different number of cells per row. This seems a little tricky because when you think of a table, you think of it's the same number of rows going across, or sorry, the same number of columns going across, but every row is independent of the previous row. Okay? So, it kind of goes back to when we created it like this. When I created it like this, I technically could have said, over here, I could have said integer my array and said the first values only have 2 columns, then I've got 3, then I've got 1. So I'm saying here there are 3 rows. The first row has 2 items, the second row has 3 items, and the last row has just 1 item. So there's no rule saying you can't do that. So you just have to make sure when you do this to not go out of bounds, because if you say print the last item or print item 2 in a row 0, it would crash. So with that being said, the length of a 2D array, you need to think of it as there's 2 ways to call length. There's the length per row, or there's a length for how many rows there are. Okay? So with that being said, if I've got, going to my arrays example, if I say my array print my array dot length, that is saying I am printing how many rows there are. Okay, so in this example there are 3 rows. How many rows? Versus if I said print my array at row 2. At row 2 dot length, this would print 1. This is saying at row 2, how many columns are there? So if I say my array at row 2 dot length, it tells you how many columns. If you're just telling the array itself dot length, that tells you how many rows. It's easy to remember it this way. An array has to have one set of rows. You can't have rows is always the same. But columns, each column can have a different number of items in it, as this example shows. So when you call the row in the length, that tells you how many columns there are. Okay? So here would be an example of printing off how many rows there are by uneven is the name. Here says how many columns there are in row 0, how many columns there are in row 1, and so on. Okay? So, here it is saying the implementation of a 2D array. This will go ahead and save some memory for a 2-dimensional array, and this will actually then go ahead and create 3 rows. And then you could say, okay, the first row's got 3 columns. Okay, and then you could then say my array 1 equals 3 or equals a new int 2 and so on. So that's how you could make a 2D array that different rows have different number of columns. Okay, so okay, so this is a continuation of how pointers work. Here we have a two-dimensional array. There's 3 rows, and each row has different values. Now, assume we wanted a row that started with 0, 0, 0 in it, row 0. We want it to equal 194. So here's if we created a new array called 194, and we said our array, called my array, this is the 2D array, the row 0 is now equal to x. So it's not that you're replacing the values, you're removing the pointer or changing the pointer from its original array. You're saying now point to this new array that I've created. So if you printed off the array 0 at array 0, you would get 194, but you're kind of doing this could create some sort of issues. You don't want to have pointers going all over the place. It's just not an efficient way to do it. So instead of creating a new array and then assigning your original array equal to the new one, just replace its values. Okay? So this is how a two-dimensional array looks when you have different values. Notice there is nothing at row 0, column 3, or row 1, comma 2. So it would crash if you tried to tell it to do anything in there. Okay, now we're going to get to printing a 2D array. So we have an array, it's an uneven array. We have a for loop that handles how many rows there are, and we can say go ahead and print what row we're at. So this would print row 0 at first. Then you need a nested for loop on the inside that takes care of the columns. Okay, you can think of it as, in order for me to print a singular array, I needed a for loop that went through every location in my array, going left to right. That's what this does. This takes care of my columns. Okay, start at 0, and remember, to find the column length, you need to do the array at that row dot length. Then this is how you access each specific value in your 2D array. Row is whatever you signed up here, so it starts at 0. Column starts at 0, so it'd print 1. After it did this print statement and go back to here, column would go to 1. So row is still 0, column is now 1, so it'd print 9. Column would increment, it would print 4. Then uneven row dot length would equal 3, so 3 is not less than 3, so it would, this prints a new line, so it print 194, it print a new line, and then row would increment to 1, and now the same thing. And because this for loop is inside of this for loop, it's this on row 1, so after row 0, column starts back at 0, and it prints off 0 and 2, then row increments to 2, column goes back to 0, and so on. Okay? So that's pretty much it for two-dimensional arrays. My next video will show you a practice example of using a 2D array.